The European Union is back in the International Criminal Court's ruling on Israel's occupation of Palestine. On Friday, the United Nations Court ruled that the 57-year occupation is unlawful. For more on this, I'm joined by Brooks Spector, an international relations expert. Brooks, appreciate your time this afternoon. What is the significance of the European Union back in the ICJ's ruling on Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories?
Well, good afternoon. Good to be with you. I mean, in a real sense, the effect of the ruling is symbolic. The International Court of Justice has no police force or arresting arm that it can do anything with, and so it is effectively saying to the court of public opinion that individual nations must begin to do something one way or the other, but it can't enforce or order anyone to do anything. And it can't order the Israelis to do anything either. But what it has had is a ripple effect with some countries like or associations like the European Union saying that they take cognizance of this, and whether they will move from that symbolic statement to specific acts is a matter, obviously, of conjecture down the road. It might be useful to point out that this particular ruling had its roots in hearings or in a case which was filed over 2 years ago. So it isn't, in a sense, directly connected to the recent one the South African government pursued at the International Court of Justice, or the International Criminal Court for that matter. What it has done is it probably has gotten the backs up of the more right-wing members of Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet even further than they already are. Although, having said that, it may encourage other elements in the Israeli political universe to say, we need to begin more actively to reach a solution to our occupation. But there's a tangle in all this, of course, because it isn't, strictly speaking, a military occupation solely and totally, but there are, 700,000 or so settlers who have moved to settlements in the West Bank territories over the years. Some of them are recognized by the Israeli government, and some of them aren't. They're carried out by even more right-wing individuals. And so the one thing I would add to all of that, though, is that back in 2005 or 6, I'm trying to remember which year it was, when the Israeli government decided to leave Gaza, literally every settlement was removed. And the difference, of course, is it was a much smaller number of people who were there. When you're talking hundreds of thousands of people, you're into a very different set of circumstances.
So the ICJ has no legal powers to force Israel to do anything. Who does, based on this judgment by the ICJ?
Well, as I tried to allude to, an individual country can decide on or government of a country can decide on the basis of such a judgment that it would take certain steps. For example, it would cease and desist from selling any material that is either military in nature or dual use. That would be one conceivable thing a nation might do. It might set more conditionalities over trade or travel. That's another thing that it might do. A country might make severe diplomatic representations to the Israeli government. It might make more difficulty in the exchanges of people and information and other such relations with Israel. But those would all have to be necessarily things that are done by individual countries on the basis of their own ideas about foreign policy, rather than, strictly speaking, because the ICJ had made a ruling, therefore it was incumbent upon other countries to follow it. So it's the ICJ, of course, wasn't originally set up for these kinds of things. It was it was meant to be a place where states could adjudicate their differences over territory or over treaties. This is a somewhat different set of circumstances, obviously.
So this opinion by the ICJ, is it any different to other opinions that they've given or rulings that they've given around Israel or around the conflict between Israel and Hamas? And I ask
Yes,
this because there's been literally no movement, no countries across the globe have been moved into any form of action despite almost 40,000 deaths since October 7th.
Well, this ruling is different in the sense that it talks to specific territorial issues. In other words, who has the right to claim sovereignty over the territories of the West Bank, and who therefore has the right to exercise sovereignty. That's very different than the way in which a conflict is being conducted, specifically the current conflict with Gaza. And as a result, a lot of this ruling, a lot of the pieces of the content of this ruling are obviously the subject of internal Israeli politics. You'd be very, very hard pressed, I think, to find an Israeli who says, no problem, let's surrender East Jerusalem, which is part of the findings in the newest judgment, because years and years ago, East Jerusalem was integrated into the city of Jerusalem writ large, and it would be an enormously complicated thing to arrange to extricate it, A, and B, to get Israeli citizens to go along with the concept. The territory of the West Bank has never been incorporated into Israel proper, with the exception of some very, very minor border changes, because there is no final determined, officially sanctioned, fully agreed upon border to West Bank. It is in effect where the fighting stopped back in 1948, and so it's called the Green Line as opposed to an international border, although for most purposes, increasingly, it has been treated as if it were a border. There are guard posts and travel regulations and restrictions on movement and all the rest. The real difficulty, obviously, is going to come with the settlements that are within the West Bank, which are inhabited by Israeli citizens who vote in Israel's elections and who are largely, but not completely, but largely beholden to the more right wing of the parties in the current government. Or I guess better put, the government is beholden to those right-wing parties that are supported by the settlers living in those settlements, both legally approved and the informal ones that have been set up. As a result, moving forward, I don't think this particular ruling is going to achieve anything tangible in the short run, although it will put more pressure on the Netanyahu government to consider more seriously how it's going to have to carry out negotiations for the often mentioned but rarely understood or agreed upon two-state solution.
How does this pressure come about? Because in the last few months, there have been various rulings that have come out from a couple from ICJ, certain steps that have come out of the UN General Assembly and Security Council, but it would seem that very little has moved the Israelis.
Well, that's true. In part because the Israelis, and let's be clear about this, the Israelis up until today anyway, have always felt that their back is covered, maintained, watched, guaranteed, protected by the United States, although in recent months, as a result of the Gaza conflict, as a result of other actions, that tension with the American government has become much more public. One of the things we're going to have to watch really carefully is if Benjamin Netanyahu goes to the United States to have a speech in front of the joint session of the United States Congress, what kind of a meeting is he going to have with officials of the Biden administration. What in the world will he say to them, and what will they say to him? And remember, even during the Trump administration, the previous one, presuming there is only one, I'm saying it that way, the green line line of demarcation was never eliminated in terms of the way the United States would agree to it, with the two exceptions. The Trump administration supported the Israeli, effectively the annexation of the Golan Heights in the north, in those mountains between Israel and Syria, and to a considerable degree the incorporation of East Jerusalem within Jerusalem city as a whole. But other than that, the West Bank, or Gaza for that matter, has never been seen by the US government as territory of the state of Israel. And there's no reason to assume the Biden administration would change on that. Although I must confess, I have no idea what a Trump administration round two would do. I mean, that would be a subject of
I'm a little disappointed. I'm a little disappointed to hear you say that, because that was going to be my next question. That if Donald Trump does take office at the end of this year, what is his likely attitude towards Israel?
Well, I mean, we go on the presumption that it would be a continuation in large part with his attitudes in the Trump administration version one, and that's full-throated support in almost all directions in almost every way. But the Israelis, of course, have never said, with the exception of a couple of far-right politicians, oh, the heck with it, let's just annex the West Bank. That's never been a state policy of the Israelis.
Okay, now, finally, in what ways can the European Union leverage its support for the ICJ ruling to push for a resolution to this Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Well, I go back to what I said right at the beginning of our conversation, that, there could be representations about all the different kinds of things that relate to travel and trade and financial transactions and greater restrictions on the way in which people can travel, most especially the most right-wing members of the Israeli cabinet, making it very difficult for them to enter European Union nations. That's been mooted by some people. But keeping Benjamin Netanyahu out of Europe is an unlikely thing. But what's his name, Simotrich or Ben-Gvir, there'd be a lot of sympathy for that in a lot of places, I suspect.